As Ji Yun stepped out, he was flanked by his entourage of attendants and court musicians dressed in ceremonial white and deep crimson. Sun He followed close behind, adjusting the hem of his robe with trembling hands, whispering blessings under her breath. As the group moved down the polished corridor, another door opened at the far end, revealing Min Seo stepping out with her maids, her hair adorned with delicate pins that shimmered in the morning light. Yet, her face was pale, her posture unsteady. Their eyes met and Ji Yun immediately noticed it. The unnatural stillness in Min Seo's gaze. The faint sheen of sweat across her forehead. She looked ill. Unwell. But there was no time to say anything. The head court official called softly, "Crown Princess Jiaomi, it's time." Ji Yun gave Min Seo one last glance, that held subtle concern, before turning away and walking forward. As he approached the palace courtyard, the full scale of the ceremony unfolded before him. Red carpets lined the steps, golden ribbons fluttered along the palace gates, and a sea of nobles, court ministers, and villagers had already gathered in their designated seats, all dressed in their finest. Ahead, standing tall and immaculately dressed in royal robes, Kyung Hoon waited for him under the grand ceremonial arch. His eyes never left Ji Yun's face, offering the smallest smile that only Ji Yun could see. But Ji Yun's gaze swept beyond him, catching sight of the royal family. The queen sat stiffly, her face carefully masked behind a forced smile. But Ji Yun could see it in her eyes, the displeasure, the disdain, simmering beneath her regal mask. King Jiang, beside her, looked tired but composed, his expression unreadable. And just in front of them standing with the nobles was his own father, Sungmin, arms folded behind his back. He kept his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor, pointedly avoiding Ji Yun's gaze. Meanwhile, at the far end of the courtyard, Min Seo followed her own path toward the ceremonial platform. Her steps were slower, her balance shaky, but she held her head high. Her gaze flicked across the sea of people, past the priests, the curious villagers, and the nobility, until it locked on Taejin. He was standing with a group of nobles, but unlike the others, his eyes downcast. He wouldn't meet her gaze. That alone told her everything she didn't want to hear. Her chest tightened, but she kept walking. To her right, she could see her father Jin Suk, his face smug and proud, already drinking in the moment. Her aunt and Jin Mu, her husband, looked equally pleased, whispering amongst themselves. The atmosphere buzzed with grandeur, but underneath it all was a deep, lingering tension, like the kingdom itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The wedding courtyard fell into a reverent hush as the sacred marriage rites began. Kyung Hoon and Ji Yun faced each other beneath the grand ceremonial arch, their hands at their sides, eyes locked in quiet understanding. A female officiant stepped forward, her voice clear and melodic. "Bow to the people." Together, they turned and offered a respectful bow to the gathered crowd, nobles, ministers, villagers, everyone watching with anticipation or judgment. "Bow to their royal majesties, the king and queen of Waiyan." They turned once more and bowed deeply toward King Jiang and Queen Hyan. The king nodded with solemn dignity. The queen's lips were drawn tight, barely managing to nod in return. "Now," the officiant said with a gentle smile, "bow to each other." Ji Yun and Kyung Hoon turned back to face one another and slowly bowed, deeply, meaningfully. As they rose, a red silk ribbon was brought forward. With delicate precision, it was wrapped around their joined hands. Then Haru stepped up, staff in hand, voice strong and certain. "Under the witness of the gods, do you choose to walk this life together? To rise in joy, to endure in hardship, to rule in wisdom, and love with honor?" "I do," Kyung Hoon said first, his voice unwavering. "With all that I am." "I do," Ji Yun echoed, the words catching slightly in his throat, then steadying. "With my whole heart." Ceremonial cups were handed to them. They each drank from the other's vessel, a sacred exchange of trust and unity. Then, as tradition dictated, they leaned in and kissed. The courtyard erupted in applause, a sea of clapping, cheering, stunned gasps and whispers. But not all hands clapped. The queen sat stiffly, her eyes burning into the scene. Sunmin's jaw was tight, unmoving, his arms folded in disgust. Jin Suk, his sister, and Jin Mu barely concealed their disdain. Their lips remained firmly sealed. Then came the next rite. It was Min Seo's turn. As she stepped forward, Haru's expression subtly changed. For a moment, a shadow of tenderness passed over his face, because the young woman kneeling before him was not just a royal candidate. She was his granddaughter, though she would never know it. With ritualistic grace, Haru lifted the scroll and read aloud, "Lady Min Seo of the House of Jin, by the decree of His Majesty and the blessings of the heavens, you are hereby installed with the title of First Royal Concubine to Crown Prince Kyung-hoon. Do you accept this honor?" Min Seo drew a deep breath. "I do." Haru nodded. "Then, you may rise." He gave her the scroll. Gasps and murmurs moved through the courtyard as Min Seo collected the scroll. She stood and took her place beside Ji-yoon and Kyung-hoon. Together, the three of them turned to the crowd and bowed. But just as the ceremony seemed complete, a shift occurred. The king slowly stood, regal and imposing in his deep red robes. The courtyard fell silent again. King Jang's voice rang loud and clear. "On this sacred day, I wish to make one final proclamation before my reign ends." Eyes widened. Ministers exchanged anxious glances. "I, King Jang of Waiyan, do hereby abdicate the throne, and pass the crown to my son, Crown Prince Kyung-hoon." The words hit the courtyard like thunder. Everyone was in disbelief. Jin Suk shouted abruptly, his face contorted in shock. "Your Majesty! I was never informed. As Minister of War, I find this sudden decision not only reckless but disrespectful to the council and I am sure most of the council do not agree with this," he continued, but to his surprise, the king's supporters raised their hands. "We agree," they murmured. "You forget yourself, Jin Suk," the king interrupted coolly. "I am still the king. I require no permission to step down." Gasps swept through the crowd. King Jang continued, "This kingdom needs strength, vision, and youth. My son has shown all of these and more. He will do what I could not, bring balance to a fractured nation." There were shouts, some in protest, but many more in support. Jin Suk nearly fainted, but Jin Mu quickly held him, annoyed as the people began to clap and chant. "Long live the king! Long live King Kyung-hoon!" With reverence, King Jang removed the crown from his own head. He turned to Kyung-hoon, who had knelt down, and slowly, solemnly, placed it upon his son's head. The king stepped forward. "By the will of the previous sovereign, and the voice of the people, we proclaim Kyung-hoon, rightful king of Waiyan." Ji-yoon was also crowned beside him, declared queen consort of Waiyan. Meanwhile, Sunmin clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His face was calm, but inside he burned with fury. This isn't over, he thought bitterly. He would wait. Watch. And strike when the time was right. The streets of the kingdom roared with celebration. Banners rippled in the wind, petals rained down like blessings from the sky, and the sound of drums and gongs echoed from every corner. Inside the royal carriage, Ji-yoon and Kyung-hoon, now king and queen of Waiyan, sat side by side. The canopy was open, allowing the people to see them clearly as they waved with poised smiles. Ji-yoon's hand trembled slightly as he raised it, his face serene yet overwhelmed. Everywhere he looked, children cheered, merchants bowed, villagers crying with joy. Beside him, Kyung-hoon smiled with quiet pride, his eyes sweeping the crowd before stealing a glance at Ji-yoon. "You look like you were made for this," Kyung-hoon whispered, low enough for only Ji-yoon to hear. Ji-yoon smiled faintly. "I don't know about that. But I'll try my best." Meanwhile, behind the grand display of joy and power, Minio, still adorned in her royal garments, wavered as she stood by the side of the courtyard. A sudden wave of dizziness crashed into her, and her legs buckled. Minio, came Taejin's voice, alarmed as he rushed forward and caught her just before she collapsed to the floor. Her maid screamed in panic, and Lady Han immediately rushed over. "She's burning up," one maid gasped. "She hasn't been well since morning," Lady Han explained quickly. "I thought it was just nerves." Together, Taejin, Lady Han, and the maids rushed Minio to a private room in the palace. Taejin gently laid her on the bed, his brows creased with worry. "Has she eaten? Slept?" he asked urgently. "She barely touched her breakfast," Lady Han replied, wringing her hands. A physician was summoned swiftly. The elderly man bowed and examined Minio's pulse with practiced care. But the longer his fingers stayed on her wrist, the deeper his frown grew. His eyes darted quickly around the room. Then, he looked straight at Minio, who was now awake and groggy but registering the tension. "May I speak to Lady Minio alone?" he asked delicately, his tone firm. Lady Han narrowed her eyes. "Is there a problem?" "It's a sensitive matter. I assure you it's nothing alarming." Minio, catching the urgency in the physician's voice, quickly nodded. "Please. I'm fine. Just give us a moment." Reluctantly, everyone exited the room, Taejin lingering the longest before he finally stepped out under Lady Han's stern gaze. Once the room was quiet, the physician leaned in and whispered, "Your Highness, you are with child. It's been slightly over 2 weeks." Minio's eyes widened in disbelief. Her lips parted but no sound came out. Her head started to hurt, trying to come to terms with the words she had just heard. "Pregnant? Are you absolutely certain?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am," he said gently. "That's why I couldn't say anything in front of the others. I have to ask, is His Majesty the father?" Minio looked away, swallowing hard. "That doesn't matter." The physician fell silent, understanding the gravity of her situation. After a beat, she reached into a drawer and handed him a small pouch of gold. "Please," she said quietly. "Don't tell anyone. Not even your apprentices. I trust you will keep this to yourself." He nodded solemnly. "I understand, Your Highness. You have my word." He left and the others returned shortly after. Minio smiled weakly and pulled her blanket a little higher. "It wasn't serious," she said, forcing a light laugh. "The physician just had to check places I wasn't comfortable showing with everyone around. That's why I sent you all out." Lady Han sighed in relief. Taejin, however, didn't look convinced. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked gently. "I am," she said quickly. Lady Han's gaze flicked between the two of them, narrowing slightly. Something in Taejin's tone, his expression, gnawed at her. She stepped forward, stiffly placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your Highness, you shouldn't linger too long around the king's woman. It would be inappropriate." Taejin, caught off guard, dipped his head. "Of course. My apologies." He gave Minio one last look before quietly leaving the room. Alone, Minio lay back against the pillow, her heart pounded in her chest. She was doomed. Taejin is the father, but if anyone finds out. Her fingers instinctively went to her flat stomach. "If I tell him, he might stay with me, even run away for the sake of the child. But would it be out of love, or guilt? And worse, what would her father do? Kill me. Kill the child. He might even kill Taejin." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I have to find a way," she whispered to herself, placing a protective hand over her abdomen. No one must know. Not yet. And with that, the weight of her secret began to suffocate her, even as the kingdom celebrated just outside her door. The room trembled with fury. Inside the lavish estate, Jean Suk, his sister Mrs. Jean, and her husband Jean Mu paced like caged animals. The velvet drapes were drawn shut, muffling the celebrations echoing from the palace. How did we not see this coming? Jean Suk growled, slamming his fist on the table. We were so focused on grooming Minio that we didn't even consider they were planning something this bold. Mrs. Jean, seated stiffly, sneered. We were fools to think that sick old king had anything left in him. We thought we had him and the palace under our control, but, abdicating to that boy right under our noses. And using Minio to keep us distracted, Jean Suk muttered bitterly. They used her like a shiny coin, keeping my suspicions dull. I should have known when he suddenly decided to make her the royal concubine. I should have. Jean Mu poured himself a drink, his usually calm demeanor tight with unease. This changes everything. With Kyung Hoon on the throne, we'll be under surveillance. If he starts digging, the kidnapping ring and the Yin dealings. He won't be able to do much, Jean Suk snapped, but his tone held no confidence. Not if we act quickly. He strode to his desk and grabbed a scroll and ink, scribbling a message with trembling urgency. We need to alert the Yin Emperor. He must be made aware of the change. If Kyung Hoon gains momentum, it's over for us. He rolled up the parchment, stamped it with his personal seal, and handed it to a trusted guard. Take this. Ride now. Do not stop for anything or anyone. The guard bowed and disappeared into the night. By evening, the palace shimmered in the soft glow of lanterns. Drums rolled as Kyung Hoon and Ji Yun, now king and queen, returned from their public tour. The gates opened grandly, and the people bowed low, calling out praises. Long live the king! Long live our queen! Ji Yun still hadn't gotten used to the title, his heart skipping every time it was shouted. Beside him, Kyung Hoon offered a calm, confident smile, though his hand tightened ever so slightly around Ji Yun's as they stepped through the palace doors. Min Suk, now donned in his formal armor, approached and bowed low. Your Majesties, he said with reverence, though his eyes still sparkled with disbelief. Congratulations. It's an honor to serve you both. Son, he rushed over to Ji Yun excitedly and bowed. Your Majesty. Ji Yun smiled. But the warm welcome turned cold quickly. Standing in the center of the great hall, flanked by a silent entourage of noblewomen and guards, was the queen. She was dressed in muted royal colors, a delicate veil resting over her head, symbolizing her shift from reigning queen to dowager. Her smile was thin, carved into her face like porcelain. Your Majesties, she said, voice smooth. Congratulations on your ascension. Kyung Hoon gave a polite nod. Mother. I have come to inform you that His Majesty, your father, and I will be moving into the reformed palace. It's quieter. Less chaotic. But don't assume I'm retiring completely, she added, her gaze sharp. I will continue to observe palace affairs. She took a step forward, her sharp eyes landing on Ji Yun. Leaning close, she murmured just loud enough for him to hear. You look beautiful today. Almost convincing. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. But don't forget, dolls are lovely because they know how to sit still. You do well to remember that. Her voice dipped darker. If your truth ever slips, you won't get a second chance. I'll be watching. Ji Yun held his breath, but didn't flinch. He bowed slightly, as if in gratitude. Satisfied, the Queen Dowager turned with regal grace and left the hall with her entourage, the sound of her footsteps echoing against the marble. As the doors closed behind her, the silence was suffocating. Just then, Kyung Hoon turned to Ji Yun. Don't let anyone make you feel small, Kyung Hoon said firmly, his hand cupping Ji Yun's cheek with a tenderness that contrasted the sharp conviction in his voice. "You're queen now. You walk with your head high, by my side. You have power. You should own it." Ji Yun smiled faintly, touched, though his nerves still fluttered beneath his skin. "Even if I'm terrified half the time?" Kyung-hoon leaned in, brushing his forehead against Ji Yun's. "Especially then." An awkward cough was heard. They turned and saw a maid stepping in, her face blushing as she bowed deeply. "Sorry to interrupt your majesties, it's time to prepare for the evening. Tradition calls for you to separate now and await the consummation ceremony." Both Ji Yun and Kyung-hoon flushed instantly, pulling back with wide eyes. Kyung-hoon let out an awkward laugh. "Right, protocol." Ji Yun, red to the tips of his ears, nodded and followed the maids. As they parted ways, Kyung-hoon whispered, "I'll see you soon." Ji Yun's new chambers, the queen's quarters, were breathtaking. Everything shimmered with elegance. Red and gold drapes billowed gently from high ceilings. The scent of jasmine floated in the air from fresh flowers arranged by the silk-draped pool. The floors gleamed, and the carved wooden furniture glinted in the soft candlelight. There were scrolls, gifts, intricate fans, and jewelry that only a queen could touch. A small group of maids bowed as Ji Yun entered, their smiles polite. "Your Majesty," one of them said, stepping forward gently. "Shall we help you bathe and change into new robes?" Ji Yun blinked and shook his head quickly. "No, thank you. I'll manage." The maids exchanged knowing looks but didn't press. "Of course. Your bath and robes are prepared. Wine and food have been laid out for the evening." Soon after, they left him alone. Ji Yun stood in the center of the vast chamber for a moment, soaking it all in. He let out a slow breath, then moved quietly to wash and dress himself in a comfortable but formal robe. He didn't touch the food or wine. He simply sat by the window, watching the moon rise, waiting for Kyung-hoon. He didn't know how to feel. Anyone else would be happy, but deep down, he wasn't, because he knew he was going to keep playing this role his whole life. He loved Kyung-hoon, but this was torture. A part of him still yearned for freedom, something he was starting to think he would never have. Elsewhere in the palace, Min Seo was lying in bed, her hand resting on her stomach. Her eyes stared blankly at the ceiling as a maid approached, speaking softly. "Your Highness, I was sent to inform you, the king won't be visiting tonight." Min Seo didn't even flinch. "Fine," she said quietly. The maid hesitated. "Would you like some tea? Or? No. Leave." Once she was alone again, Min Seo curled on her side, tears pricking her eyes. What was she going to do? All that consumed her was the growing dread of the child inside her, and the truth she dared not speak. Later that night, the silence in Ji Yun's chambers was broken by the soft creak of the door. Kyung-hoon entered slowly, dressed in loose ceremonial robes. He found Ji Yun waiting by the window, bathed in silver moonlight. Their eyes met, and in that instant, all the tension, fear, longing, and love they'd held inside melted into something wordless. Kyung-hoon crossed the room in a few steps, reaching for Ji Yun like a man reaching for the one thing that steadied him. Ji Yun didn't pull away. They kissed, tentatively at first, then deeply. Hungrily. Like two people who had fought too long for a moment they weren't sure they'd ever reach. They held each other as if the world outside didn't exist. And then, with soft whispers, they made love, gentle at first, then fiercely, wrapped in silk and moonlight, hands trembling, hearts certain. Far away, across mountains and frozen rivers, in the heart of the Yin Empire, the wind howled over the dark palace that loomed like a fortress carved from obsidian. A servant, panting, stumbled into the vast, shadowed throne room. He dropped to his knees and held out a sealed message. Seated high above, the Yin Emperor, a surprising middle-aged but dangerous man with hollowed eyes, opened the scroll. His mouth curled into a crooked smile as he read the news. So, he made his son king. His eyes glinted like daggers. He tore the scroll and tossed it aside, then leaned back in his throne, fingers drumming against the armrest. Let them celebrate. My wrath will soon descend upon them. Thanks for watching. Do like and subscribe to the channel for more episodes.